The giants described in the Bible have always been a subject of mystery and fascination, even for those who have never encountered the scriptures of the Old Testament. These colossal creatures, who once walked upon the earth, remain an enigmatic presence in ancient records. However, what few know is that these giants did not form a single race. There were different tribes and lineages, all descendants of the Nephilim, hybrid beings resulting from the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Each of these races had unique characteristics and played crucial roles in biblical history. In this video, we will delve into ancient records and reveal who these mysterious post-flood giant races mentioned in biblical texts were. Get ready to uncover hidden truths that few know. After the cataclysm of the Great Flood, the book of Genesis, chapter 6, presents one of the most enigmatic and fascinating passages of the Holy Scriptures, the appearance of the giants. The sacred text describes the sons of God, who upon seeing the daughters of men and recognizing their beauty, decided to take them as wives, creating a hybrid lineage of beings known as the Nephilim. These beings, giants in stature and power, inhabited the earth before the flood, but mysteriously reappeared after the event. The question arises, who were these sons of God mentioned in the account? The key to understanding this question lies in the Hebrew term used in the original text, Ben Ha-Elohim, which in Aramaic can be translated as Ba'alaha. Both expressions are commonly associated with celestial beings, such as angels, suggesting that the giants were not merely humans of extraordinary stature, but rather a hybrid race, the result of a forbidden union between fallen angels and human women. These angels, known as the Watchers, had abandoned their heavenly posts and corrupted, sought to interact with humanity in unholy ways. The idea that the giants were direct descendants of ancient demons places them not only as colossal beings, but as corrupted forces, originating from the very spiritual chaos that preceded them. The biblical account reveals that before the flood, these creatures multiplied in number and power, spreading terror, corruption, and violence across the planet. They were an essential part of the chaotic scene that, according to the scriptures, led to the divine judgment and the great flood that purified the earth. However, the question still persists. How did these beings manage to reappear after the flood? The answer to this question is not unanimous, but many scholars believe that even with the destruction of the original Nephilim, the fallen angels continued to exert influence over humanity. Their presence in subsequent periods was disguised in various forms, infiltrating ancient civilizations and creating new generations of Nephilim. The continuity of this demonic presence would be one of the main reasons for the emergence of new manifestations of corruption and spiritual decay. Furthermore, historical and biblical accounts point to the involvement of these demonic beings in pagan cults, where they were associated with priestesses who worshipped ancient gods. The Bible repeatedly warns that these gods were not mere human inventions, but rather demonic entities in disguise, whose main intention was to infiltrate religious practices and gain worship and power. This phenomenon was not limited to the Old Testament alone. In the accounts of Moses and Aaron before the Egyptian pharaoh, the Egyptian magicians were able to perform supernatural feats, such as turning staffs into serpents. This act, more than a mere illusion, highlights the presence of dark forces operating through these magicians, suggesting that contact with the supernatural and with malevolent entities continued to shape humanity's destiny. The crucial point that stands out here is the idea that, although many consider these stories as mythology or simple fables of the past, there are indications that the beings mentioned, though invisible to our eyes, continue to influence the world in ways far more subtle and powerful than we can imagine. The presence of the Nephilim, both before and after the flood, goes beyond mere figures of great stature. It is a representation of how supernatural forces can interfere in human history in a silent but deeply impactful way. The giants, therefore, were not just beings of enormous proportions. They were a direct reflection of celestial rebellion, a visible mark of corruption originating from the fallen angels who, by uniting with human women, created a hybrid lineage of powerful and dangerous entities. These beings, in some way, continued to play a mysterious and disturbing role in human history, even after the flood. The divine judgment of the waters was not the end of the Nephilim, but rather an interval in their presence, for soon after, a new generation of giants appeared, spreading across different regions of the Middle East and beyond. The Bible describes these creatures as imposing warriors, some of whom established strategic domains and became great threats to the surrounding peoples and nations, including Israel itself. The scriptures reveal that at least 5 races of giants inhabited the vast region, stretching from the Levant to Mesopotamia, with a strong presence in ancient Egypt. Their descendants spread across lands that today correspond to Israel, Iraq, Syria, and neighboring countries, founding strongholds and building fortified cities, becoming insurmountable obstacles for the peoples who sought to invade or expand their territories. One of the most impactful accounts of these titanic creatures is found in the book of Numbers, chapter 13. When the Israelites were sent to spy on the land of Canaan, they were terrified upon encountering the descendants of Anak, one of the most feared giant tribes. The spies, observing the Anakim, described them as creatures so enormous and intimidating that, in comparison, the Israelites saw themselves as mere grasshoppers. This account not only illustrates the size and power of these creatures, but also the psychological and moral impact they caused, generating panic and discouragement among the Hebrews. Furthermore, the text mentions the strength and impressive numbers of the Canaanites, who had fortified cities defended by these supernatural beings, making any attempt at conquest extremely challenging. The fear caused by the sight of the giants almost led the Israelites to abandon their conquest of the Promised Land, which by itself reveals the magnitude of these beings' influence in biblical history. They were not just a physical threat, but also a symbol of the spiritual struggle between good and evil, between divine forces and corrupted forces. The presence of these giants, with their supernatural origins, suggests that the battle for the Promised Land was not only territorial, but also a spiritual war for divine sovereignty over humanity. In the next segment, we will continue uncovering the 5 races of giants mentioned in the scriptures, exploring their origins and the significance of the names given by ancient peoples. Each colossal tribe has a unique story, extending beyond their imposing stature, reflecting supernatural influences and cosmic forces that challenged human comprehension. The first and perhaps most notable race of giants in the scriptures is the Rephaim. These colossal beings are among the most enigmatic and feared in biblical history, often associated with the domain of the dead. The name Rapha, singular of Rephaim, carries profound meanings that evoke a connection with the afterlife. The term Rephaim, in both Hebrew and Phoenician, does not merely refer to giants, but rather to entities that inhabit the threshold between the world of the living and the dead, almost like specters or wandering souls crossing the boundaries of the physical world. But why did the ancients view the Rephaim in this way? The answer dates back to the Great Flood, a cataclysmic event that, according to the scriptures and ancient traditions, wiped out the giants from the earth. These beings, who had multiplied and spread terror, were eradicated by the divine waters. However, after the waters calmed, these creatures returned in a mysterious manner. How was this possible? Accounts from ancient civilizations indicate that the fallen angels, powerful beings who had rebelled against God, continued to interact with humans. These beings, often worshipped as gods, returned to unite with mortal women and generate a new generation of giants, perpetuating the lineage of the ancient Nephilim. The stature of the Rephaim defied any human concept of greatness. They were true titans, creatures of proportions that seemed supernatural. One of the greatest examples of this colossal race is Og, the king of Bashan, whose measurements impressed even the oldest records. It is estimated that Og was around 15.4 feet tall and nearly 6.6 feet wide, making him a true mountain of flesh and bone. Many other members of the Rephaim were described with similar characteristics, suggesting that this race had a uniform stature, making them feared by all surrounding peoples. The second race of giants to traverse the lands of Canaan and spread to other regions were the Anakim, descendants of Anak. These colossal beings, like the Rephaim, were known for their immense stature and unbeatable power. However, unlike the Rephaim, whose name evoked a connection with the dead, the name Anakim carries a disturbing revelation about their origin. The term Anak was not just a common name, but a crucial clue about the true legacy of this race. Derived from ancient Sumerian, Anak or Anakin means sons of those who fell from the sky, shedding a dark light on their origins. This meaning implies that the Anakim were not just giants and formidable warriors, but direct descendants of the ancient gods or entities that, according to ancient traditions, fell from the sky. These supernatural beings, often identified as fallen angels or pagan deities, descended to earth, defying divine laws and establishing a new lineage of giants. The Anakim, as descendants of these celestial beings, possessed a direct connection with the spiritual world, a heritage that granted them power and authority over humans. The accounts of the Anakim emphasize their strength and imposing stature. The scriptures describe them as gigantic warriors whose heights exceeded those of ordinary men by more than 6 to 10 feet, with some estimates suggesting they could reach between 11.5 feet and 14.4 feet tall. This colossal height made them a formidable threat, with some reports indicating they could rival the Rephaim, reaching heights over 14.8 feet. These giants were not only powerful in terms of physical strength, but also had a supernatural aura that made their presence even more intimidating. Their divine origin, or rather their descent from the fallen, suggested that they were more than just simple warriors. They represented a dangerous mix of human and supernatural forces, a heritage of rebellion against divine order. As a result, the Anakim became symbols of resistance to celestial authority, a continuous threat to humanity, and a reminder that evil forces were always lurking, attempting to corrupt and subvert God's creation. If the Anakim were feared for their supernatural strength and celestial lineage, there was a third race of giants that terrorized the lands of the Middle East and spread panic throughout the Levant, the Emims. The mention of these giants is found in the scriptures, specifically in the book of Deuteronomy 2:10-11, which says, "The Emims had dwelt there, a great and numerous people, as tall as the Anakim." This verse is revealing, as it directly compares the Emims to the Anakim, suggesting that, like the Anakim, the Emims were beings of extraordinary height, probably surpassing 13 feet tall. The implication is that these giants might even rival the Rephaim, known for their monstrous stature. The name Emims, according to the Rabbi Rashi, can be translated as fearsome or monstrous, a term that not only reflected their terrifying appearance, but also the profound psychological impact they caused on the surrounding civilizations. The meaning of their name hints that, in addition to their immense stature, the true terror caused by the Emims was in their horrifying presence. However, what truly distinguished them was not just their size, but also a physical and behavioral trait that made them even more fearsome: their roar. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, one of the primary historical records about the giants, describes the Emims as having a roar so terrifying that it could be compared to the roar of a lion. This guttural, fierce, and resonating sound created a wave of fear that froze even the bravest warriors in terror. Furthermore, the Emims were described with grotesque and distorted features, which seemed to reflect the brutality and terror they caused, making them even more terrifying than other giant races like the Anakim or the Rephaim. While the Anakim were known for their immense strength and celestial lineage, and the Rephaim for their dark nature, the Emims stood out as true monsters whose psychic presence could paralyze the surrounding peoples. Their existence, marked not only by their physical strength but by their ability to instill visceral fear, left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the ancients. They represented the persistence of evil, manifested not only in their size, but in their ability to terrorize others with their overwhelming presence. The fourth race of giants that ravaged the Middle East was the Zuzim. These giants, although not as well known as the Emims or the Anakim, also appear in the pages of ancient records as one of the colossal races that dominated the region. The name Zuzim, derived from an Aramaic term, is interpreted as rigid, strong, or robust, a description that reflects both their impressive stature and their superhuman strength. Reports indicate that the Zuzim were between 9.8 feet and 13.5 feet tall, positioning them as titans who roamed the earth with brutal force. Like the other giants mentioned, the Zuzim were part of the mysterious lineages of supernatural beings that marked ancient history. The presence of the Zuzim, although not as well documented as that of the Anakim or the Emims, is recorded in the book of Genesis 14, where they are mentioned in the context of the war waged between Kedorlaomer, king of the Elamites, and various other tribes. During this war, Kedorlaomer led a devastating military campaign against the tribes of the region, and the Zuzim, who inhabited the territory of Ashtaroth-Karnim, were some of the victims of this offensive. The massacre of these giants, which marked one of the many episodes of the war between humans and giants, resulted in the diminishing of their presence in the ancient world, weakening their influence and spreading their downfall across various lands. The defeat of the Zuzim was not just an isolated event, but part of a series of battles that reflect the ongoing struggle between human forces and supernatural entities. The fall of the Zuzim represents symbolically a temporary victory for humans over the giants, but it also raises questions about how present these supernatural beings were in the lives of the ancients, and how their influences continued to affect the fate of civilizations. The presence of giants in ancient traditions, especially in the biblical scriptures, was not merely a matter of physical size or battle power. These colossal beings represented something greater: the presence of cosmic and supernatural forces that defied natural and spiritual laws. Each of the giant races, from the Rephaim to the Zuzim, carried with them a set of unique characteristics that reflected different aspects of evil, corruption, and destruction that permeated the world after the flood. As the giants were defeated and their lineages became extinct, their names and legacies continued to echo through traditions, reminding the ancient peoples that, no matter how much human nature tried to resist, the supernatural forces were still active, influencing and shaping history in an enigmatic and often terrifying manner. The last race of giants mentioned in the Old Testament is one of the most mysterious and little known, the Zamzumim. Inhabiting the lands of the Middle East, more specifically east of the Jordan River, these giants emerge as the last vestige of the feared lineages of colossal beings that had dominated vast regions for generations. Although briefly mentioned in the scriptures, the story of the Zamzumim is shrouded in mystery, with few details known about their origin and their fall. Like the Zuzim and the Emims, the Zamzumim were described as giants of imposing stature and immense strength. Ancient records suggest that these giants were between 13.1 feet and 14.8 feet tall, placing them among the largest of all the races mentioned in biblical traditions. The similarity with other tribes of giants in the region, such as the Zuzim, is evident. They were known for their brute strength and the fierce presence they commanded in their territories, establishing themselves as one of the last colossal tribes to inhabit the earth before their eventual extinction. The Zamzumim were formidable warriors, and their presence was a constant threat to neighboring tribes. They occupied strategic lands and dominated vast regions, asserting their control over the communities that dared to approach. However, as in many other giant stories, the tide of history was relentless. The Bible describes how the Ammonites, descendants of Lot, came into direct conflict with the Zamzumim, fighting for the fertile lands that once belonged to these giants. In a biblical account, the Ammonites were able to defeat the Zamzumim and take their lands, gradually erasing any trace of the ancient race. This conflict between the Zamzumim and the Ammonites is significant because it marks the end of the great giant lineages in the Middle East, with human tribes emerging as the victors. With the defeat of the Zamzumim and the Ammonites taking possession of their lands, the era of giants came to a close. These events symbolize the transition from the old order, dominated by supernatural and colossal beings, to a new time in which humans took control of the lands and civilizations began to expand. Many scholars suggest that the Zamzumim were a subdivision of the Rephaim, another race of giants mentioned in the scriptures. If this theory is true, it means that the Zamzumim lineage not only occupied the territory east of the Jordan, but also other regions such as Syria and parts of what is now Israel. This hypothesis suggests that, in the distant past, vast areas of the Middle East were dominated by these giants, and that the Zamzummim might have been one of the last manifestations of this ancestral race, hunting and being hunted until their extinction by the smaller peoples that emerged. Additionally, some scholars believe the name Zamzumim may be related to the Hebrew word Zamzummim, which means conspirators or plotters. This would suggest that, in addition to their immense physical strength, the Zamzumim were also known for their strategic cunning and ability to form treacherous alliances. This interpretation could also shed light on the fact that their fall was not merely the result of the brute force of the Ammonites, but also a reflection of political manipulation and alliances with other forces. With the final defeat of the Zamzumim by the Ammonites, one of the last giant lineages of the Old Testament was eradicated. The story of these giants, though shrouded in mystery, reflects the constant struggle between humans and the supernatural forces that preceded them. The wars and conflicts described in the Bible were not only physical battles, but also symbolic representations of a spiritual struggle for sovereignty over the earth. The extinction of the Zamzumim and the subsequent fall of other giant tribes marked the end of an era. However, the legends of these colossal beings persist to this day, fueling the collective imagination and research into the hidden and supernatural forces that once ruled the ancient world. These accounts, passed down through the centuries, continue to intrigue scholars, mystics, and researchers of the occult, who seek to understand the true nature of these giants and the impact they had on ancient civilizations. The Zamzumim may have disappeared from the pages of biblical history, but their legacy, like that of the other giants mentioned in the scriptures, remains alive in many traditions and myths. They remind us that, deep within human history, there has always been a struggle between men and the forces of a world beyond our own, and that, though these beings have vanished, their presence and influence still echo in the shadows of ancient collective memory. I hope you enjoyed this video. May God bless you, and see you soon.